Anna from NHCSR. It is still wintertime and we are still planning our field season for the upcoming growing season. And I'm very interested in sweet potatoes. It's kind of an unusual crop for the Northeast up here in New Hampshire, but I think it's a really fun crop. There's a lot of interesting answers to be had. Problem is, I don't know how to grow sweet potato. I'm an entomologist. I am not an expert at growing things. So I need a little bit of advice from my go-to for learning how to grow things in general. That's Caleb Goossen. He also has quite a bit of experience growing sweet potato commercially and has recently contributed to some research that has been going on at the University of New Hampshire. I had him start out by explaining his sweet potato background, his bona fides, and then we got into the nitty-gritty of experimental design and where I should be putting my efforts this summer.
I am Caleb Goossen. I am the crop specialist for the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, which means that I work for a nonprofit, but my role is very similar to that of somebody that works for Extension. Previously, I had worked on an organic vegetable farm for about 9 years, and we grew sweet potatoes there in southern Vermont. I continue to work with growers who work with sweet potatoes or grow sweet potatoes. Being in Maine and having been in the northern half of New England, it can be difficult to get much of a yield of a sweet potato crop. But it certainly can be done, and it seems increasingly so with warmer, longer seasons. Also, there are some potentially exciting newer varieties coming out that may better allow for northern production of sweet potatoes. Some intensive breeding efforts up in Canada. I was clued into that by our mutual friend Becky Seidman, who is a researcher at UNH, and I was able to tag along for one of her sweet potato variety trials a couple of years ago as sort of another location to be a replicate. The main gist of her results in that, like, yep, the standbys for northern New England, Beauregard and Covington, of the varieties that I looked at were, the highest yielding. Unfortunately, I didn't have some of the newer and more interesting varieties that Becky had at her site in New Hampshire, but she had some that seemed promising. The other big takeaway I had was either there's just enough difference between her site in Durham, New Hampshire, and my site, which was in Unity, Maine, which is sort of mid-coast Maine, a little inland, or she's just really good because she got about twice the yields that I got across the board.
Wow. Well, the newer varieties, though, does it come down to just like time to maturity? Do you think that's what they're really breeding for? Just like a quicker...
That's a really good question for Becky. I will say that I don't know that she found that the orange, the classic orange sweet potato varieties, I don't know that she found any that were drastically higher yielding than Beauregard or Covington at her site. I would be curious if they, did do better further north where it's a little colder. She was more finding some of the other more unique varieties. I'm hearing my father's voice in my head being very mad at me for saying more unique, because unique, that's not grammatically really correct, but purple varieties and white fleshed varieties, and, where the flesh and the skin maybe differ.
Okay, so you'd be getting more value from the novelty of that variety than the yield of the crop.
Possibly, although what I am remembering from some of what initially started me asking Becky if I could get involved somehow, she had seen some reports of this one orange variety from Canada that was yielding much better for them in their conditions. I don't want to misrepresent her findings because I'm not sure I'm remembering it all very well, but
well, I can
I
ask
do.
her. I'll get a chance to bend her ear about it later on this week.
Yeah, there's clearly some stuff to talk about there.
But I'm really curious to hear, like, what's the demand? Like, the folks that you work with, how many people are growing sweet potato? What are they looking for? What are they excited about?
I think there would be more demand if folks could grow them without plastic. because really to make sweet potatoes work in New England, it's hard to do it without a lot of plastic in the form of mulch and row cover.
Yeah.
What I did for our leg of that variety trial was I did put them in black plastic mulch and I hooped them and covered them with row cover. And I left that row cover on for at least 2/3 of the season.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, I was like, oh, I'll take it off when it gets, maybe crazy hot, or it just seems like the foliage is too far gone. Eventually, I took it off because the foliage was like big enough that it was growing up the sides of the row cover and flopping down and sneaking out. Um, but the um, it was a wet season. There was a lot of
Yeah.
clouds, and it never got like crazy hot. And I don't think that would stop sweet potato anyway. I think they like it hot. I think if you're in a cooler spot, it's pretty hard to do it without as much soil heating and row cover. I think IRT plastic would probably also help if folks have that infrared technology plastic that heats up the soil a little bit more than black plastic alone.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that on me at the time.
And does any of this fit into organic standards?
You can use
Plastic.
plastic mulch in organic standards.
Okay.
You can use row cover. You can't use biodegradable plastic mulch because
Mm.
the rules are that it needs to be at least this large portion, or maybe still for plastic. I think it may have to be entirely bio-based.
Mhm.
So the feedstock has to have come from a non-synthetic source. It can't be petroleum derived.
Oh.
Um, and then it has to meet certain compostability standards. But this is still an area of contention. Say your standard is that 99% of it has biodegraded. How many years of 1% of it not biodegrading do you have before that's an issue? Because if you're leaving 1% every year, then eventually it adds up.
Right.
What's it breaking down into? Is it just the plastic that degrades? What about the colorant? What's added in there as well? Things like that. So it's
Yeah.
definitely still a contentious thing, but I'll say even among non-certified growers that I talk to, um, a lot of folks just don't want to use as much plastic
Yeah.
for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
The expense, more so the expense of getting rid of it, the
Yeah.
hassle, concerns about microplastics in the soil, etc.
Okay. Well, from a production point of view, that makes a lot of sense, and it seems like there's a lot of things up in the air. I find it to be a really compelling crop just because it sounds like it's really easy to grow. Like, I'm an entomologist. I am, looking at trials that I can do, and I'm quite nervous because I don't know how to grow things. Like, this is a big professional embarrassment for me. And I was like, sweet potato, I can do that. And like, what are the pests that impact this? Like, maybe we could do defoliation. Like, is that interesting or important? And it sounds like maybe not because there are some insects that will take a bite out of these plants. And I have seen what I think might be bad infestations of some of the more obscure northern pests. But it sounds like the key pest in this system is probably deer. Would you
Do
agree or
you,
disagree?
so first, I'll just add on to like why it is a nice, easy one to grow is that it doesn't have a high fertility demand,
Yeah.
and also they store really, really well. So if you have winter markets, you can be given you can still have sweet potatoes. Most folks can't meet the potential demand because if you could grow enough of them, you could continue to sell them all through the spring, probably. In terms of pests, I would say, yeah, in the growing season, before they're even really creating the root, um, the deer would be the biggest pest, but also closer to harvest would be voles.
Voles.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'd also say maybe wireworm would be another one. And
Yeah,
equally hard to predict as voles.
yeah, maybe. I mean, you should have some sense of, if you are familiar with wireworm, you should have some sense of your likelihood to be growing in ground with big wireworm presence or not.
Yeah.
because, if it's been in vegetables and you've only had really brief cover cropping in between, and especially if you did it with non-grass species, you probably don't have wireworm in the soil,
Yeah.
or at least not much. I have also seen something bigger, took big bites that was like, I think it was maybe white grubs
Yeah,
causing a fair bit of
I could see that.
damage, but that's really hit or miss. Seems kind of unusual.
It is unusual, and from what I understand, usually you'll see that the same as wireworm, like after a grass or in summers where there's like a lot of irrigation need. So an irrigated plot of vegetables in a really dry landscape. The next year, sometimes you'll see white grubs in places where you don't expect it. Going forward, if I was going to proceed at looking at the effect of defoliation on the above ground part of the plant, on the below ground part of the plant, do you have any advice for me as far as like how I should prioritize my treatments? Like,
So,
would you like to see something that's more like deer defoliation earlier in the year, later in the year, multiple defoliation? Do you have any advice for me?
well, I don't know that I have specific advice, but I'll share some how I would think through it, I guess.
Yeah.
Because the deer feeding, I would expect, I mean, unless you're in a spot with very high pressure, I would expect you'd have the most pressure early season.
Yep.
But that's also when you're most likely to have covered plantings, and so less likely to have it be open to them. However, if you're growing a large area and you don't want to invest in the row cover to cover that entire area, and it's a warm spring, early summer, you probably don't need to cover them. And so that would be really a critical time. However, if we're talking early enough, like it's sort of a if you're those seedlings can sit for a little, not seedlings, but the
Slips.
cuttings can sit there, and once they start to really just start branching out, if they got chomped down right then and there, I think it'd be game over, most likely. So it would kind of be a moot point. You'd have to let them get at least a certain stage, and maybe that's when people would start uncovering. Although I think you'd really just be wanting to uncover to cultivate and trying to do it before the vines are getting too far out past the bed to cultivate effectively. That would be my personal bias. I also suspect deer feeding would be the second or maybe more feeding would happen at the end of the season. Things are cooling down, and but I also don't know if it's going to matter then. I guess it's possible because that is when a lot of the bulking is happening, right?
Yeah. And if you think about it, that, like, so sweet potato and Irish potato aren't even remotely related. But I am borrowing from experimental design done with Irish potato, where there's a certain point in that plant's physiological timeline where you can have defoliation and it doesn't impact that bulking phase. So I am kind of thinking about timing it like that, and especially if you think that like deer would be coming in early and late, that would be nice to say like what happens if you lose a lot of plant tissue really early, like that could be one treatment, and then later on would be maybe like losing different levels of defoliation, like 25-50% defoliation during a critical time. Like, what would that critical time be? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Well, I do think, some of the initial growth happens, and defoliation then, if it's not too severe, this is, it depends on the severity, right? But some initial defoliation then may not really hinder things because it uses up some of the sugars that were going to go to more growth,
yeah,
but it may also just encourage a lot more branching, and then you may get a bigger plant that has
it might be good. It might be better.
right, right, like
Oh,
topping.
yeah.
Like when you pinch the buds on your first set of peppers. Not everybody does that, but many do, and then you get a bigger plant that can support more peppers. Right,
Yeah.
is the idea. but I think it is that question of how many solar panels are you taking away versus battery, like stored energy that was taken away at the same time.
Yeah.
Uh, Later on, you've got a lot of biomass there above ground, and I assume below ground. I mean, those root systems can be pretty extensive, and then it's just the ones kind of near the crown that are primarily bulking up. I don't know how much of that energy was already stored in those roots because
Yeah.
the rest of the root system, they're not really useful as a crop, but they are big. They have bulked relative to like just feeder roots.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know the carbon flow basically that's happening, right? It's like when and where does it go?
Well,
Um,
I can ask other sweet potato growers their opinions, but it is very helpful to think about these production practices from your experience to think about what is the best what is the best way to spend my time. Are there more interesting questions to ask about sweet potato other than like having varieties that do better in shorter, colder climates? It's one of those things where like it's it's something I can do, but in like the three eyes of experimental design, interesting, important, and I can do it. I feel like I can do it weighs a little bit heavier. Like, what is more interesting or important, do you think?
I mean, there's some of it that's just the basic agronomics, right?
Yeah.
Like, uh, does it help to tweak things a little bit? What if you really crammed them in and just upped the fertility a little bit? I don't know that sweet potato does this as much, but you can think about a lot of crops where you put them closer together, you'll get a higher population per area. And so your overall yield tends to go up when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
However, the size that you're getting of each individual crop is maybe smaller. Do you want the highest yield of onions, or do you want to grow really big jumbo onions?
Yeah.
And that also plays into it in the other direction. I mean, uh, I have had customer feedback in the past of like, we don't know what to do with onions this big, right? So, so then the next year you're like, oh, maybe we need to plant these a little more in competition with each other, and
Yeah.
then you take up less row space, you get a higher yield per bed. Is there where are those crossover points for sweet potatoes? And I think that's trickier because people have such varied experiences. Sometimes they have giant sweet potatoes and just a couple per plant or one per
Yeah.
plant. Sometimes they have a lot of smaller ones. And what's more valuable to their customer? What are they actually trying to go for?
Right.
And how much does it vary year to year? That's the real trick.
Well, I was slightly convinced that this might be an important thing to consider because we are growing for a local market. We are growing for an audience of consumers who don't have the same idea of what a sweet potato should look like, right? Like if you're buying something that's grown locally, most people think they don't grow sweet potato in Maine. They don't grow sweet potato in New Hampshire. Like, what are you talking about? That must be something else, right? Or like that's like where the novelty of these new purple and white fleshed varieties are. That maybe selling something that is a little bit smaller, maybe it's tastier, maybe there should be sensory panels on this too, to say like looking at different density of planting, like having smaller roots produced versus like overall yield, and can you detect differences in flavor? Like this is something that I've been thinking about getting into, is some of these sensory panels where you're giving participants three samples and two of them are the same and one of them is different, and if the average Joe off the street can detect the two that are the same and the one that's different, there's a significant difference in flavor. So I wonder if maybe my efforts should be put in that direction more than bug stuff, because I have a one track mind. I'm always thinking about bug stuff. What do you
I
think?
think it's possible. Then, but to be like somewhat cynical, I
Go for
guess,
it.
I think a lot of people just like I personally probably fall into the camp of like if it's not orange, it's not a sweet potato. Even though I've eaten sweet potatoes that aren't orange, and I think
Right.
I'd probably like a highly processed purple sweet potato chip. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
But I also don't know that I want to deal with, like I personally am, if I'm cooking, I'm like, yeah, let's have less skin, more meat. So let's have a bigger
Yeah.
sweet potato and just give me that orange stuff that is
Okay.
sort of falling into the same category as buttercup squash, right?
Yes.
You cook it, it's sweet, it's good. And some people are adding sugar on top of that, which blows my mind. However, I do know that part of Becky's variety trialing was tastings, and
Yes.
she can tell you which ones folks actually felt like there was an issue or not. I think there are some other quality issues, maybe to think about, which would be like the skin. Sometimes the roots will form cracks and fissures, and that just like it it leads to a lot more waste. If the skin's more tender, I think we're more likely in my house to roast them whole, the small ones,
Mm-hmm.
and just eat them skins and all. But if it's not as tender of a skin, then no, we're not. Um,
Okay.
and
Okay, so I agree with you. A sweet potato should be orange. So I'm gonna grow Covington, and I'm gonna mess around with planting density because like I really like the idea of having a treatment where like I have heavier density, so we can look at yield in terms of number of tubers and pounds produced per row foot. I'm gonna have a treatment where I do an early and say like, oh, maybe that does better, like kind of anticipating a heavier crop, above ground crop load, and then the rest of the treatments I think I'm going to push until some fine day in the fall when there's a lot of lush growth, imagining different rates of defoliation. I have to think a little bit about how I'm going to calculate that, but I guess I could eyeball it, like 50%. That's pretty easy to estimate. But would a
one,
deer eat 50% of a vine?
not of an entire field,
That's true.
but maybe in one spot they would probably
Yeah.
actually take some like just about all the way down. The
Yeah.
other thing that's interesting about sweet potatoes is because those vines all do come back to the central point,
Mm-hmm.
you can either use that to maybe, I don't know, like lift up this half of the plant and that half, and that might help you think through
Okay.
um, your biomass. But I think even if a deer, I'm trying to rack my brain as to what I've seen their feeding damage look like, because a vole could straight up just like, you know, cut it off right at the top, and then you have no foliage feeding the roots anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think deer would eat through the vines, but they could. Because
Okay.
we're also talking about like what's simulating the actual feeding. Is it
Yeah.
removing just the individual leaves, or is it removing a vine, a tender section of vine?
Yeah.
Um,
Because if it was insects, it would just be the leaves, and I would leave the petioles behind.
and I feel like I've seen that
Yeah.
behind a lot, and that would
So it could be
argue
like,
more for you going
yeah,
out there with a push
exactly.
mower.
Yes, yes. So that, well, yeah, because like I could also compare what I'm doing to, I think there has been work looking at when people mow to prepare for harvest later on down the road,
Uh,
that kind of thing. So I could find that critical moment by looking at the literature for mowing in preparation for harvest and time it for that. Okay, this is very helpful. I have a lot of questions in mind that I still need to work out, but I'm getting closer.
and if you figure out how to get the golden tortoise beetle to not lose its golden coloration after you kill it,
I
you'd have
know,
so many like jewelry makers that
so
were in love
pretty.
with you.
I know. I do have a colleague, a fellow, a lab sister who makes jewelry out of emerald ash borer elytra, and they stay very shiny and beautiful.
But it's also fascinating to me that the golden tortoiseshell don't, and that they can change in your hand.
It's nuts, nature. All right. So I'll leave it there for now, but I think I have a plan and I think I might know what I'm doing. But please let me know if you have any other questions that aren't reflected in my plan here. What are your priorities? Do you prefer a big, huge tuber, a big, huge root, or do you prefer more smaller roots? Preferences? Let me know.